do not profess to be an expert in these topics. But I don't think anyone actually can profess to be an expert in the particular topic we're going to discuss tonight. Because as far as I know, I don't think any accredited academic has ever really dove into the topic. So I have pretty good confidence in my abilities as a researcher, and having sort of learned literally at the knee of both my parents and all four of my grandparents who were so deeply settled in this area, I feel I have a pretty good context of local history in which to put the research. But it's always, not always, but recently it's been a mystery to me, which is where did all of our colonial houses go, right? We think of Altamont presents itself as a Victorian village, but those of us who appreciate the history know that our history is much older than the Victorian area. At the time of the Revolution, there were at least 200, probably closer to 300, maybe even 400 people that lived in and around what we today call Altamont. So with that population base, where are the colonial houses? And it's always been a real head scratcher for me. So where did I put the... Am I sitting on it?
Yep, you are.
I'm sitting on it. It's a wonder it didn't go haywire. So to start, I'll just invite you to sort of close your eyes a bit, I guess, or just take yourself back to 1776 and consider this region. This map got a little cut off. That shows Schenectady, the sort of densely populated area. We're a little to the south of that. But they annotated the houses that existed, and this is, I think, from 1771. The houses that existed at the time. And then there was a little notation on the map. It says, about 20 families, underneath what they referred to as the Hellebergh. And if you then throw in the area that was then referred to as Black Creek, which is now sort of Guilderland Center, Osborne Corners, we sometimes refer to it as, and also then take the area up on the hill, which was sort of no man's land at the time, but still you get a population base of about 200-300 or so people. So I invite you to take yourself back in your mind and think, okay, it's the Revolution, it's the colonial era. What did the houses look like? What kind of houses would our forebears have lived in? If you're thinking this is sort of the typical Revolutionary era house, right? The sort of 2-story center hall, the classic colonial, right? Named for the colonial period. That's if you just stop someone and show them this picture, they would say, yeah, that's a colonial house. And then you bring it a little closer to home, and you say, yeah, we have those kind of houses here in and around Altamont. This is, of course, the Nauer House, right on the outskirts of the village. The next one is the Minders Frederick House in Guilderland Center. The last one, of course, is the Frederick Krauntz Farmhouse, right? So yeah, this area, we have those big center hall, 2-story colonials, so mystery solved. And with that, I sort of challenge, and I see Josh Talon, who lives in one of these older center hall stately colonials, and I could have put his house picture up here, but I'll just sort of query Josh. Josh, what year was your house built?
Are you challenging me?
No, I'm not challenging. I'm asking you to sort of share, what's the best guess as to when your house was built?
Well, it depends where you look. I mean, so the National Archives say 1800.
1800.
I think it's later than that, but...
Okay, so Josh has a house very similar to these in terms of design and structure to these center hall colonials. It was built in 1800. If you had thought those were colonial houses, you would be wrong. The fact of the matter is all those houses, the Nauer House, the Minders Frederick House, the Frederick Krauntz houses, were either built or substantially reconstructed after the war. They are all what we refer to as, at the time, an English-style house, right? 2-story, center hall colonial, and in fact, the houses that I showed in the first slide, they're all from Massachusetts. It makes sense, right? And why we think those would be, that must be the colonial house that we had around here. And people have heard me give talks on our challenges here, bringing out our local history in New York State history is, Harvard wrote the history. right? So when we think of the colonial period, the New Englanders were so dominant in establishing the consciousness of what was colonial that we all tend to think that whatever happened there is our story here. But that's not correct. We had a very different story, and it looked very differently, particularly in terms of domestic architecture. With very few exceptions, Schuyler Mansion being one, there were almost no English-style two-story houses in and around Albany or anywhere in the Hudson Valley, right? That type of architecture didn't present itself in this region until after the war, what was referred to by the locals as the Yankee invasion, right? After the war, this area was overwhelmed, and I'm using terms that would have been used by my Dutch forebears, overwhelmed by Yankees, right? And they brought with them their taste, their styles, their habits, and fundamentally changed this area for good. But prior to that, and during the term of the Revolution, what was dominant was the Dutch influence, right? The Hudson Valley was settled by the Dutch, 1614, 1624. And though the English technically ruled it beginning in 1664, I think, the fact of the matter is this area remained very, very Dutch. I love this quote from this gentleman. This is a New Englander who visited Albany in 1808. He said, "Albany was indeed Dutch in all its moods and tenses, thoroughly and inveterately Dutch. The buildings were Dutch, Dutch in style, in position, attitude, and aspect. The people were Dutch, the horses were Dutch, and even the dogs were Dutch." And he said that with a bit of derision, because the Yankees really kind of looked down on the Dutch and the Albanians. They considered them to be very, very backward, slow, not at all enterprising. Of course, the Dutch didn't think too kindly of these invading Yankees, right? And you know, throughout American history, there's always been sort of the principle of the other, right? We struggle with that today, right? The groups that are trying to get in and get the benefits, right? Well, in Albany in 1790, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants were very much the other, because it was the Dutch who were dominant, and they saw their way of life and their culture, including their architecture, you know, basically going by the wayside. So if this area up until the Revolution, and including the Revolution, was thoroughly and completely Dutch, what does that mean for the domestic architecture of the time? Well, the Dutch style of architecture, and all this is in contrast primarily with that English style found in New England, it was primarily brick, not exclusively, but primarily brick, often with very intricate bond work, the different designs and the way they laid the brick. Almost as a rule, 1.5 stories. Almost never saw a full two-story home in the Hudson Valley. Characterized by very steep roof lines, right? Very high-pitched roofs. Also, many of the houses, both in the city, in Albany, Schenectady, which was considered a city at the time, but even in the countryside, there were parapet walls, which are basically a projection of the gable that went up and above the actual roof line. So it's almost like a false front on the front of the houses. Some later executions around here, particularly in the countryside, involved what we would call a Dutch gambrel roof, that sort of slanted treatment. What we refer to as a Dutch colonial house, like you see, like in I grew up in a Dutch colonial house off Western Avenue, right? We didn't have any of those. They were all down in generally New Jersey, that sort of gambrel type roof. Not very common around here, with dormers in the gambrels. We did have a few gambrel roofs. The Wemple House over in Rotterdam, which is the third one. The first one is the Brot House. That's in Rotterdam, over by the Mohawk River. It was built in 1736. That was actually built by my 7th great-grandfather. The next one is also a Brot House. I'm taking a little home team advantage by getting the ancestors in there. And this was in downtown Schenectady. This is where the YMCA building is now on State Street in Schenectady, across from the community college. I used that so you could see, this is when it was being dismantled, so you can see the real steep pitch of that classic Dutch roof. The next one is the Wemple House, which still exists over on Wemple Road, I think it is, right over by Pine Grove Fire Department, over in that neighborhood, not far from here. The next one is the Bronx House down in Cooksaki. That was built in 1660, I think, definitely 1600s. Actually, there's a local connection to the Bronx. If anyone knows Betty Ketchum, longtime library trustee, Betty's family home up on Ketchum Road was originally built by the Bronx family, a descendant of, I think, the grandson of the man who built that house. And then the last one, of course, is the Van Allen House, and that's over in Kinderhook. But this is kind of what the Dutch, the Dutch houses look like, and Dutch was the dominant, almost exclusive style in the Upper Hudson Valley. So knowing that, the mystery. We know that there are well over 200 people that lived in and around Altamont. Altamont is still largely rural, right? So there's been no significant development pressure in terms of tearing things down, like what happened, like say, in the city of Albany. There's only one or two existing original Dutch buildings in the city of Albany, but that was because over the years, development pressure, they were not economically, wasn't highest and best use, so they tore them down and replaced them with something else. That type of pressure wasn't found out here, right? So that isn't what contributed to the loss of the houses. Also, we said that Dutch houses were made primarily of brick, sometimes of stone. Brick and stone are far more durable than wood, right? So why didn't they last? So where are our houses like the ones that were depicted there? Where did these 200 or so people live, and what happened to them? Developing a couple of clues and unearth a series of clues, and then trying to, from those clues, take learnings, which then in turn I think could be used to hopefully solve the mystery of where our colonial houses are. The first clue is the Hellebergh, which was the name of this region, wasn't really all that Dutch, right? We know it wasn't English. We assumed, I always thought, oh yeah, this area was settled by the Dutch, and it was Dutch. It really wasn't all that Dutch. It was a mixture. It was a mixture of Germans, Dutch, English, a few Danes, the Severson family, right? The first family to settle in what is now the village of Altamont. They were from Denmark. And a few French Walloons who spoke French as their primary language. So this area was much more of a mixture. If anyone's ever read Russell Shorto's book, Island at the Center of the World, about New York City, a lot of his major themes there could be applied to this area as well. Much more of a mixture of largely Northern European, almost exclusively Northern European, but not exclusively Dutch. And to bear that out, in this immediate area, there were, at the time of the Revolution, 3 churches in existence. Only one of them was a Dutch Reformed church, right? That was the church down at the, across from Phillips Hardware, where the Guilderland Cemetery still exists, right? And that's now Hellebergh Reformed Church is the successor church to that one. The other 2 were Lutheran, and Lutheran was primarily the German church, right? The Dutch Reformed Church, they spoke Dutch, the services were in Dutch. The Lutheran churches, the services were in were in German, right? And there were 2 Lutheran churches here. One at the top of Hawes Road, where Fairview Cemetery is. That was St. Jacobus, St. James Church. And then another one up just beyond what we always call the Highland Farms Restaurant, at the top of the hill in Knox, right at the intersection where you take the turn to go to Warner's Lake. That was another Lutheran church that existed at the time of the Revolution. It's called Zion Lutheran Church, colloquially called the Kleichman Church. And this one is not there's no pictures of the original St. James Lutheran Church, and that is the predecessor of St. John's Lutheran Church here in Altamont. There's no pictures, but that is a picture of a Lutheran church down in the lower Hudson Valley, to give you an idea of what it possibly looked like, the local Lutheran church. The center one, that is the actual Zion Lutheran Church. Now that was built after the Revolution, but that sat right up on the Bern Altamont Road as you approach the hamlet of Knox. And then the third one, that is also, that's the actual Dutch Reformed Church, the Helleberg Reformed Church that sat at Osborne Corners down across from Phillips Hardware. So the fact that there were 3 churches, 2 of which conducted services in German, only 1 conducted service in Dutch, I think supports the thesis that this area was probably more German in its orientation than even it was in Dutch, right? Even the place names around here were sort of a blend with a slight skew in favor of German. The Schwarzkill, the Black Creek, right? We call it Black Creek today. That was the Schwarzkill, which is German, of course, for Black Creek. The Bosenkill, now that was a Dutch term, right? Crazy stream, or crazy creek. The Normanskill, that was Norwegian, after the Brock brothers who were from Norway. Settles Hill, the Settle family, Zettel, Z-E-T-T-L-E, they were from Germany. Even the word Hellebergh and Hellebergh, right? Art Gregg's book was Hellebergh, H-E-L-L-E-B-E-R-G-H. That's German. That was the original term. It was subsequently changed to Hellebergh, which was the Dutch way. So the locals called it Hellebergh. The people in Albany, who were predominantly Dutch, called it probably Hellebergh, and they wound up carrying the day. So all of this sort of contributes to a working thesis that this area was probably more German than it was Dutch. So with that, and just sort of backing up just a little bit, and just sort of setting the scene before even the Germans or the Dutch arrived here. Why here? Why would any European build here? This area was very close to the boundary between the native Mohican territory and the native Mohawk territory to the west, right? Where we sit today, going as far, really almost to the Foxenkill and Burn, was Mohican territory, right? The delineation between the tribes followed watercourses. And if a stream or watercourse flowed into the Hudson River, it was Mohican land. If it flowed into the Mohawk, it was Mohawk land, right? These streams that all come down through Altamont, they flow to the Hudson. This was Mohican. Foxenkill is the first stream you hit west that actually goes into Schoharie Creek and then to the Mohawk. So the Mohawk boundary line was pretty much about somewhere in the present-day town of Knox, right? Now the key thing to remember is these were very different people, right? To our shame and detriment, we tend to think, oh, Native Americans, they had entirely different cultures. They spoke not just different languages, but inherently different languages, right? They couldn't understand one another in their respective tongues. I mean, they lived this close to each other, right? Everything's relative, but they lived so close to each other, but they were very, very different. I always considered it a great shame that in this area we are so relatively ignorant, not just of native cultures generally, but specifically the Mohican people. And that, I think, is a function of, in New York State, we are so Iroquois or Haudenosaunee-centric, right, through our common 7th grade New York State Regents curriculum, which is very Iroquois-centric, right? I mean, the town of Guilderland, which was entirely Mohican land for centuries. We built the middle school, we set up houses, right? I was in Mohawk House, Tawasenta House, that's okay. Hiawatha House, that's appropriate. But they just built a new house 10 years or so ago. They called it Seneca House. There wasn't a Seneca for 400 miles, right? But we were so ignorant of our own history. There's no Mohican house, even though it was built on Mohican territory. So I just don't think you can appreciate the point enough that the distinction between the two tribes was very, very distinct. And they were almost constantly at war with each other. There was no reason for any intercourse between the tribes unless they were actually fighting. So they stayed away from each other unless they wanted to fight. So the border was pretty hard and fast, right? So in this region, it was Mohican. Why this area in particular? And the Mohicans tend to travel. Unlike the Mohawks and the Iroquois, they had settled communities, right? Larger sort of wigwam communities and palisades around the wigwam, and they were called castles, right? The Mohicans were not. They were much more transient. They would move with the seasons, and different seasons found them in a different area within their domain, right? So that's why another reason why the Mohicans haven't gotten as much due, because the archaeologists don't have as much to work with, because they didn't stay in one place compared to the Mohawks, right? But what about this place? Why would they? What mattered here to them? Well, we know that to the Mohican and really all the Algonquian people, high ground was sacred, right? In their form of religion, the higher you could get, the closer to God you were. And the highest ground was reserved for particular shamans, right? And the whole notion of sort of the wild man of the mountain that kind of came down into our culture and sort of a derivation of like Rip Van Winkle, the whole notion of a wild mountain man originated in the notion of those Mohican shamans who would go up to the highest place and be so transcended by the religiosity of the place that they kind of had a religious conversion, right? So the average Mohican couldn't get to the highest place, but they would want to get as close as they could, right? If your territory is essentially modern-day Albany and Rensselaer County, where's the highest place you can get to? Right here, High Point, Indian Ladder, right? So this was a place that they would come out to and visit and encamp and have religious type ceremonies, right? The trails that led out here for that purpose, right? Indian Ladder existed so that the natives could get to the top. It was not a trail. It did not connect to anything that went west because there was no reason for them to go west, because going west meant you ran into the Mohawks and you started a fight, right? It was a trail that ended in the place. So the trail that led out from Albany, from the Hudson River, out through the Pine Bush, down Willow Street, across Western Turnpike Golf Course, up across the Normanskill, up 146, up Helleberg Avenue, terminated right about where the Peter Young Center is. That was the destination, right? And we'll get to it. Actually, we can actually go to it now because it's relevant. When the Europeans showed up on the scene, of course, Albany was first settled by the Dutch in 1624. 1630, Van Rensselaer bought the land from the Mohicans and established the patroonship. People in Albany started migrating west, the original westward migration. The Brats went into the area of New Salem. Anyone knows the area down in the town of New Scotland called Anesquithal, right? It's Indian fields, right? Why is it? Because it was cleared. The native peoples had cleared it. It was very attractive to the settlers. I mean, think about it. This was uninterrupted forest from here all the way to Buffalo. Hard, dense forest that was almost you almost couldn't get through it, right? If you had to eat through this winter, if your family was going to survive, the idea of land that was already cleared was very, very attractive to you. So that's why the first areas to be sort of claimed and settled by the Europeans coming out of Albany were the areas that had been cleared by the Native Americans. Now, at that time, the Mohicans had been finally defeated by the Mohawks and driven off the land. The Mohawks never occupied the land. They controlled it, and their way of control was telling the Mohicans they had to go to the other side of the river. That's how they wound up in Stockbridge, Massachusetts, and they became the Stockbridge-Munsee tribe, right? So it was the areas that they had cleared were available. The settlers moved in, and Van Rensselaer, of course, made the claim for pretty much all of Albany County. A couple of other families came out. This house here that's the Truax house. That's down off near Foundry Road in Guilderland. It still exists. It's the oldest house in Guilderland. It's soon to come up for sale. So all of you interested for historic preservation, keep your eyes out that it doesn't get torn down. Built probably in 1680. And still looks very much like it did at that time. Another early settler was Evert Banker. His farm was right in where the community gardens are in Guilderland by Towcentha Park. He was the mayor of Albany, and he was a very prominent Indian trader and the superintendent of Indian affairs, which was the most important position in the colony. Right? He established his farm at that place because he then could intercept the Mohawks as they came down the Normanskill on their way to Albany, and he could trade with them before they got to the city. So it was a very strategic location. The intersection of that path, which eventually became the Palatine Road, which we'll get to, and the Normanskill was like the intersection of Latham Corners today, right? I mean, it was where you wanted to be. So Evert Banker grabbed it and established his homestead there. So you had this little sort of, and that's his house to the right. I remember when I was in high school, I went through that house. It doesn't exist anymore. it was abandoned. So you had this sort of beginning of a trickle of settlement of Europeans coming out. But the major settlement happened around 1712, right? And it was by Palatines. Who were the Palatines? They were Germans. They lived in the area of the southern Rhine, basically from Strasbourg, France, where our friend Laura Shore has just moved to, north up into Germany, up almost as far as Frankfurt. That region had the misfortune of lying in the warpath for centuries between the French and the German princes, right? It was constantly being overrun in battles between the Catholic kings of France and the Protestant princes of Germany. These people suffered year after year after year. Finally, in the early 1700s, 1706, 1707, there was such a devastating frost. It basically killed all the vineyards. They grew grapes for wine, killed all the vineyards, and it devastated the area. They had no hope. They just became sort of the original refugees. They floated down the Rhine as far as Rotterdam. They established massive refugee camps of thousands of people. Queen Anne of England took pity on them. They played up the religious aspect, that they were persecuted Protestants, and Queen Anne sort of latched onto that aspect and said, you can come to London. They came to London. They set up these massive camps in London. At first, the British couldn't have been more helpful, right? But after a while, what are we going to do with all these people in these refugee camps, right? Common refrain. We live with that today. So the British trade lords came up with a scheme. Basically, we'll send them to America. And there in the huge pine forests of the Hudson Valley, they can be put to work creating naval stores for Her Majesty's Navy. The pines are so big, and we do not, in Great Britain, we do not have a native source of mass for our warships. It's all dependent on importing from the Baltic, which was unstable. And all that, they could make turpentine, they could make tar, all these things that the Royal Navy needed and that Britain needed to survive as an island nation could be had in the colonies, and these Palatines could be put to work. Problem is, they were grape farmers. They knew nothing about making naval stores. They knew nothing about making turpentine or tar. They got 3,000 of them were shipped. It was the largest immigration to America during the entire colonial period. 3,000 of them were shipped to New York City, put on barges, sent up the Hudson. Again, huge, big camps in the area of present Germantown. They got restless. Things didn't work out. The project was canceled. There they were. They had no hope. They said that they had been promised land in the Schoharie Valley that the Queen and the native tribes had offered to them. They said, come hell or high water, we're getting to Schoharie. The governor said, no, you're not. You don't have any permission to go there. They said, screw you, we're going to Schoharie. They came to Albany. They found some native Mohicans who took them on the trail to get to Schoharie. The trail ended at the Peter Young Center. The recorded travails of those Palatines, and this was December, mind you. The snow was 3 feet deep, right? The trail ended. The recorded record of that said, we then hacked a path through the wilderness for 15 miles to get from Schoharie. If you start at the Peter Young Center and measure out 15 miles, get you right into Middleburg, or between Middleburg and Schoharie, where they eventually wound up. So that was the path by which the Palatines went to Schoharie. Now what happened along that time, and again, this is all documented, on their way, a fight broke out between the groups, right? Some of them were exhausted. It's December. They're hacking their way through the wilderness to get to this place, which they don't even know what's gonna meet them when they get there, right? Some of them said, I've had enough. This is as far as we wanna go. The others said, no, we gotta go to Schoharie. A fight broke out between, I don't know, it was literally a fist fight or a physical fight, but it was a disagreement. It is said that some decided to stay right where they were. And they called the area where they were Feckberg, which was German for the fighting place, or the fighting mountain, right? Later, historians said Feckberg was where the village of, or the hamlet of Knox is now. I think it's more likely it was to the east, probably where the trail ended, more up around, right around where my house is, right on the border of Guilderland and Knox, where your house is built. In any event, I think it's pretty well established that at least a handful of them stayed there. So they represented our very first settlers, is a element of this migration of Palatine Germans to Schoharie that just decided to stay. Very interesting piece of evidence to support that theory. An Enterprise article, and those who don't access the Altamont Enterprise archives online, you really should, because it's a treasure trove of information. I think from 1888, 1889, they said an older gentleman came into our office and was chatting about the old days, and he said, of course, it's well established that the top of the hill was settled before the valley below. That gentleman's name was Van Ernum, right? He lived down below. So coming from his mouth, he said it was well established that the top was settled. So he wasn't taking pride of, he wasn't saying my people were here first. He was saying my people were here second, because the top of the hill was settled first. So I think it was those Germans, those German Palatines in about 1712 or so that were the first settlers. What type of houses did they live in? This is a Palatine German house, right? It's very simple. It's built on what's called an H-bent design, right? It's a timber peg H, right, with a crossbar and two support beams, and then it's just the house is a series of H's. And however long you wanted your house to be, that's how many H's you built in your house, and that's how you constructed the house. Wooden for the most part, sometimes stone cladded. Always 1.5 stories, never 2 stories. And if you wanted to add on in later years, you would just add another H, and your house would get longer, right? Very simple design for very simple people. The barns were very, very similar. In fact, the barns were so similar that many places in Germany, the barns were just an extension of the house, right? You may have seen pictures of that where there was not much of a divide between the stable and manger area and the place where the people lived. No evidence that particular mode was used over here, but the barn was also tended to be that same simple H-style architecture. So that H-bent timber peg technique was so simple, it spread from that area of southwest Germany. Actually, parts of the Netherlands incorporated that as well. You can see the diagram, how it's a very simple thing. The H-bent design was incorporated into what we refer to as Dutch barns, right? So the Dutch barn has its roots in Germany. But remember, those two places are fairly close. And unlike the Mohawk and the Mohicans, there was intercourse between those two places. The languages were not that different. You could be a Dutch person of the 1700s could be understood by a German person of the 1700s and back. So there was sort of cross-pollination between these cultures. So what became what we refer to today as characteristic Dutch designs, particularly in the farm architecture, was actually a German Palatine design originally. So these are German Palatine houses in upstate New York, throughout the Hudson Valley. The top 3 are in the Hudson Valley, all in Germantown, New York, which is where the original Palatines settled. Most of the Palatines stayed put. Only about 500 of them actually wound up going to Schoharie. So the rest stayed put in either what's known as East Camp on the east side of the Hudson River, or West Camp, which is now Germantown, New York, down in Columbia County, south of Hudson. These are, interestingly, they're all church parsonages. And maybe that's why they survived, actually, because the church built them, and then they kind of probably didn't have much money, and they just kind of kept the houses in better repair. The bottom one is in Schoharie, built in 1740. That's the Lutheran parsonage in Schoharie. But this gives you a good idea of that H-style design as it's as it relate to the outside. So you have these very simple 1.5 story, elongated type residential structures. That's the Palatine house. Characteristic interior features. What we refer to as the Dutch door with pancake hinges, the door that opens the top. Those would have been found in these houses. The covered staircases right? These were small spaces, very low ceilings. They made very efficient use of the small space. So the covered staircase was the jambless fireplace. Now, in almost all Dutch houses, it was a jambless fireplace. In other words, the fire was right in the middle of the room. There were no sides to the fireplace, and there was just sort of an extension that hung out over with a little curtain in front of the mantle. The Palatine houses, some had jambless, others had what we refer to as the traditional fireplace, which had sides and a fire box, so to speak. And the garret was the top story, but it was used as living space. And of course, slavery was prevalent in the Hudson Valley through this entire time period. If a family had slaves, not many families had slaves, but if they did, they lived in the garret. There's almost no, there's only one place that I know of, and it's actually up the stone house that was the bed and breakfast next to the Peter Young Center across from your house, Bill. That's the only place that I'm aware of that had separate quarters for slaves. And that was because actually that was farmed by the owner with slaves before the owner ever took residence there for several years. So the structure was built because there was no house. But the dominant theme, or the dominant habit in Dutch and Palatine German New York was that the slaves and the indentured servants lived with the family in the house, but almost always in the top story of the garret. So then the question is, why were these houses so modest, right? The English houses, of course, were great, right? That big center hall colonial, what we all sort of aspire, that beautiful. Even the Dutch houses in Kinderhook and in Rotterdam, they were quite grand, right? Brick, and there was some elegance to them. The Palatine houses were none of that. There was no grandiosity to them whatsoever, and particularly the ones around here. Why is that? I would argue that the dominant reason was because the people didn't own the land they were building on, right? Everyone who lived here and built a house on leased land, right? And when you don't own it, you're much less likely to make a major investment in the place, right? The leasehold system under the Van Rensselaers was absolutely dominant. Now, it was a very attractive system to some people, right? If you were the fifth son of a 12-person Connecticut family, and you had no prospect of inheriting your father's under primogeniture, of inheriting the farm, a lease didn't look so bad because there was no money down. You didn't have to make any payments for 7 years. And then you had to give 4 fat chickens and some percentage of originally 10% of your foodstuffs. And then when you sold the farm, you had to pay a quarter of the sale price back to the Van Rensselaers, right? So it was somewhat attractive to people, but in terms of establishing permanence and making an investment in capital improvements to your property, it wasn't conducive to that, right? The original terms of the Van Rensselaers were for a term of years. Later on, when Alexander Hamilton wrote the durable lease after the war, but that didn't happen until after the Revolution, in which it was for a lifetime. But prior to that, it was almost always for a term of years, which made it even less attractive in terms of making a substantial capital investment. New England commentators who came over and commented on that, it was so different from the New England style, which is, everything was, in New England it was all community, you own the land, common green, but here it was just fundamentally different. And that's why our communities look different, right? You don't have community greens in the Hudson Valley like you have in New England. And that goes back to the way the land was divided up originally, right? But the commentators were so derisive of here, basically saying that the farms were slovenly, they were not well kept, they were rickety, and they make an allowance for that's just the way New Englanders were, but they probably had a point. It was not bucolic, it was not grand, and there were squatters that took part of the property, and if you're a squatter, you're definitely not going to invest in a big grand house, right? You just basically want basic accommodation. So that kind of character sort of set the tone for houses were not substantial here, right? And if the house wasn't substantial originally, it probably didn't have a good chance of surviving. The houses that survived generally were ones that were either built or added onto at the end or at the conclusion of the leasehold system, right? Once we, after the anti-rent wars, when we got all that patroon stuff behind us, and people had the opportunity to actually own the property that they were building on, you saw a flowering, so to speak. Altamont, the village, right? If the railroad had come through 20 years earlier, this wouldn't have happened, right? This would have been all Van Rensselaers, right? Maybe they would have developed this village, but the fact of the matter is, by the time the railroad came through, you could own individual properties, and individual owners could make substantial investments in businesses and homes, and that's why we have these beautiful homes, right? Because people were building for the ages, not just for the term of their lease, right? So the ones that were built before that were not so durable, right? So what happened to them? Where did they go? Most of them that survived were incorporated into other structures, right? This one right here, this is the original Adam Hilton farm up on the hill. That's where the Pollards live today, we think. Doesn't look anything like the house that's there today. I can't even figure out, what they did to the structure, but if that's the original house, it looks nothing like the house that was added onto subsequently. The one up at the top on the left, that's the Van Patten farmhouse. That's where the Battle of the Normanskill was fought. That's at the very end of Vosburg Road. That's since burned down. But I show this one because that's the original house. This was the post, anti-rent capital improvement. Same here. This is the Lanehart farmhouse, right up here on, as you go over the bridge on the way to the golf course, right? They were here during the Revolution. This is the original house. The wing is the original house. This was added on after the war. This is the Krantz house, right? The big house out on the corner, or intersection of Brandel Road and Boyersville Road, right? Big, grand, imposing, beautiful structure, built after 1800. This was the original house, right? So this is a pre-revolutionary house, right? That is not a pre-revolutionary aspect of the house. It's that. So those are just 4 examples. I would wager there's probably 2 or 3 times as many of that as you work your way around the area. That having been said, some of them still exist in largely their original form. And these are houses that I have passed literally thousands of times and would never take note of them as being revolutionary houses, right? I mean, yeah, this is the Freeman House in Guilderland Center. It's a historic marker. We know it's 1734. I use it because it's, now that you appreciate that that's how houses around here looked during the Revolution, all of a sudden you start seeing the same style, right? In houses that I never, this is down at Bayberry Lane between Guilderland Center and Osborne Corners. It's on the right-hand side, right, as you're leaving the village past the Apple Inn, right? Classic Palatine. This was the Schoolcraft House, not the one in the hamlet of Guilderland. This was the first Lawrence Schoolcraft who came here in 1750. That was his house. This one, right across from your house in the old village, right? Like I said, I've passed that house 1,000 times. I would never think, oh, that's a Revolutionary era house, right? My guess is that was one of the original Acker family properties. And then they built where Graham lives. But the house that you live in, and I'll seek your input, was probably substantially added to after the war, right? This is the Severson House on Brandel Road, right? If you look hard, it hasn't changed all that much, right? But each one of these is almost exactly the same style, right? So these are our revolutionary houses. Now, it's a little disappointing that they're not big and grand and bucolic and all, but the fact is they are incredibly historic. We just didn't know what to look for, and we didn't know what we had, and so we didn't really appreciate it. You see here, this is in downstate New York, they tended to put the entrance on the side, right, and had more. In this area in Schoharie, the entrance was almost always in the center. So this indicates that they probably added another H onto that house later. This one here in Knowledgeville, it still has the center entrance. So now I think that I would posit that that solves the mystery, right? We do have pre-revolutionary houses. We actually, and when you start looking, we actually have a lot more than I would have ever thought. They just look very different from what I was looking for, right? Because originally I was looking for colonial houses, and then I was looking for Dutch colonial houses, right? And guess what? There were none. They never existed here. But we have Palatine houses in abundance. So I challenge everybody to drive around, find as many houses as we can, and these are the ones that need the historic markers, right? These are the ones that were overlooked by a previous generation because they didn't really know the importance of the Palatine history to our area. So this is my, pardon the AI, but this is my stab, this is AI's stab of recreating the Van Aaron farm out on Brandel Road. This is the barn that still exists. Probably didn't look much like that. I think part of it was taken down in a tornado, and they reconstructed it. But this is the classic Palatine construction. It's got the Dutch hay barrack, so it has Dutch elements. You know, there's the escarpment, and this is the road. Brandel Road was the road. The Voorheesville Road didn't exist at the time, so it would have been here. This is open to interpretation because one of the weird features of the Dutch houses at the time is the front was in the back. The front entrance almost never faced the road. I don't know why, but that's how it was. So they would put the entrance to the house at the back, not facing the road. Oh. If anyone has a clue as to why that was, Graham?
Well, they actually just rerouted the roads because they always faced the front facade that where the door was.
Yeah.
It would always face the original road, but the roads have changed like drastically everywhere.
Okay.
Even where there's roads that are colonial era, they're not the actual same roads.
Okay.
That's like plus or minus, a couple of feet.
I think that's true. Although I think it was Helen Wilkinson Reynolds who wrote the definitive book on the Hudson Valley Dutch houses with Franklin Roosevelt back in the 20s. She was the one where I learned that she said the Dutch had this peculiar custom of putting the entrance in the back, which again, but I think your explanation makes a lot of sense.
We usually have bank houses and the foundation would look on grade.
That's right. That's right.
The Fort Herkimer Church really reminds me of a number of things you said. The old entrance to it was on the opposite side of where the road is now. And originally, the entrance was in the middle of the building. And then after the war, they stoned that up and made the entrance into the you went in on the long axis.
That's interesting. And it just goes to show that you can't always take what you see, right? Because you have to go deeper than that because things change considerably over the years. So I always like to leave with what's next. And I couldn't fit this into it just didn't make sense, but I find this fascinating. French's Hollow neighborhood, I think, is an area of our town that is so overlooked and underappreciated. When I was younger, you could still cross that bridge. Now, French's Hollow is relevant only because the cops bust up parties of kids down there, right? But this was really the heart and soul and center of the town of Guilderland. And what jumped out at me, originally, this was the big factory that was down there, the cotton factory or cloth factory, whatever. And I took note of it originally, a different view of it It's this building here, because it had one of those parapets that extended above the roof line. I don't know why they would do that on an industrial building. But then I saw this building here. That is a classic, it's brick, I think, brick facade. That is a classic Dutch building right here in the town of Guilderland. I had never seen that before until I was, doing the work for this presentation. Now this area was originally Abraham ten Broek's, who was the general of the Albany County Militia, right? He married Elizabeth Van Rensselaer, who was the daughter of the patroon. When they got married, the patroon gave them a large grant of land centered on French's Hollow called Elizabeth Field, right? You know that neighborhood down where Don and Maurice Stauffer built their house? That's Elizabeth Field. That's the name of the street, I think. But so he owned that. It was like a chunk taken out, the only chunk taken out of the Van Rensselaer manor, because they were loath to divide up their land. They wanted to keep it all intact. But the patroon at the time, Stephen the second or the first, gave that as a wedding gift to his daughter Elizabeth. Then that patroon died. Stephen the second became patroon, but he was young. He was only like 9 years old. So Abraham ten Broek became the regent for the patroonship. I think this was 1769. It was right before the war, right? But he developed all this. He developed these as commercial enterprises, right? He built this covered bridge across the Normanskill. This was the original. There was a grist mill, there was a sawmill, there was a flax mill, there was a cotton factory, there was a wool factory, and he had a very large farm somewhere down in here, right? And it's just like this very significant thing that I just have never, Art Drag never really touched on it. No one else has really gotten there. So, like I said, I always like to leave what's next, so I put that out there for someone needs to do a deep dive into the history of French's Hollow.
Is this before there was a dam?
Oh yes, long before there was a dam. Yes. So, ten Broek, he was the general. He was probably, after Philip Schuyler, the most important revolutionary figure in Albany County. He led the 3,000 force Albany County militia, of which Jacob Van Arnhem, our local hero, participated. It was ten Broek's charge at the Battle of Saratoga that broke the British lines, and that ultimately won the second Battle of Saratoga, I think it was. So he was a very, very important figure. But he sold this in 1800 to a guy named Abel French. And it's fascinating. Abel French was from Columbia County, I think, but also had commercial interests out in Oneida County. But he was related by marriage to the Nowers, who of course established Nowersville. He was related to the McCowns, who established McCownville. He was related to Governor Taylor, who built Normanvale, the big estate on Knott Road. So it's like this little oligarchy of these very, very influential mercantile families that kind of had their, and his, I forget what the relation was, but Jeremias Van Rensselaer was then the lieutenant governor, and in 1803 he put the legislation in to create the town of Guilderland, right? Separated off from what was then the town of Watervliet. And he was the one that named it Guilderland because that's where his ancestors came from in the Netherlands, right? And from that we always just assumed, oh, Guilderland is so Dutch. Well, no, it's because the guy who was in charge decided he was going to name it for his ancestors who never lived in Guilderland. There you have it. But I would love if someone would take up the cause of deep dive into French's Hollow, because it's a beautiful part of the town. You used to be able to access it much more readily when you cross that bridge. You can still walk across it. That's right. But, so good. And like I said, I welcome not just your questions but your comments, because this is thesis. This is not established expert. It's through thesis and counter thesis that you get synthesis. And I'm sounding like a Marxist, but that's the first and last time you'll hear me espousing Marxist theory. But that's how you get consensus on local history, right? Because these topics academics are not looking into things at this granular level. So I welcome any challenges, observations.
That Brown's barn on Brandon Road used to look much more like a Dutch barn.
Is that right?
In the mid-60s, and I remember this as a child, a tornado or something went through there and tore the roof off.
Yeah.
And the repair that was done to it was not
Consistent.
of the Dutch style. They put a lower roof on it,
Right.
and so,
And the windows just no clapboards to the sides of the HVACs in the middle.
Yeah.
That's why it's got that weird profile.
yes.
So and I heard that as well. I think it was 1960 the tornado went through, but I'd heard that as well. But even the fact that it's still, even parts of it exist. Likewise with the Van Petten barn, and there's some debate as to whether that was a Dutch barn originally or not, but you know, that still exists, and it's still owned by a Van Petten, which is remarkable. It's owned by a direct descendant of the family that owned it when the Battle of the Normanskill was fought in that barn, which is pretty remarkable. Graham, you must have some more comments or
Yeah,
input.
I'll talk to you later.
Oh, okay.
Does anybody know if SHPO has done any digging or any looking around French's Hollow? Because it seems like they find something with all of these buildings and.
You would think. I don't think SHPO has, but Vincent Schaefer, who was one of the founders of the Dutch Barn Society, and was a professor and worked at GE. He and his brother Paul, if people know the name Paul Schaefer, was very instrumental in the Adirondacks and preserving many lands in the Adirondacks. But Vincent Schaefer started as an amateur archaeologist in the 1920s and 30s. His papers are all at the archives at SUNY Albany, and he has a tremendous file. He did archaeological work on Native American not settlements, but temporary villages that the Mohicans had on those flats on the Normanskill, and it's rich. And if my friend Don Rittner, if people know Don Rittner, he chairs the town's 250 Commission. He actually got a lot of Vincent Schaefer's artifacts, which include hundreds of native artifacts that Vincent Schaefer dug out of those fields back in the 20s and 30s. And there's some really neat photographs in that. So, and it's open to the public at the SUNY Albany Archives. It's the Vincent Schaefer collection. And what's really neat about that, almost all that land is publicly owned. I see Supervisor Barber in the background, but basically from Towasanta to this area is owned either by the town of Guilderland, in very great foresight in buying it, or the city of Watervliet as part of the Watervliet Reservoir. So the good thing is I don't think it's under significant pressure to lose what's there, but we've just never really focused on it as an area of great significance. And it's only been recently that we think, I think it's pretty much established now, that we had the Battle of the Normanskill site entirely wrong for years, and that's also in that immediate neighborhood.
I just wondered, from what you said, it sounds like the Dutch were perhaps a little better off economically than the Germans, in that the Germans, they only built a 1.5-story house. Was that for economic reasons? And did the Dutch also do 1.5?
Yes, the Dutch houses tend to be 1.5 stories as well. But your original point, I think, is accurate. I think it's generally understood that in communities where there are both significant, and there's only a few, Schoharie, although Schoharie was predominantly German, with a little bit of Dutch. Germantown, predominantly German, a little bit of Dutch. And in our area, the Hellebergh, there was a socioeconomic difference, and the Dutch were a little higher on the socioeconomic ladder, so to speak. I mean, example, the Van Arnhems, right? We think that they were probably a relatively well-to-do farm family. Mrs. Van Arnhem was a banker. Evert Banker was a very successful trader and merchant. The Germans tended to be more, not necessarily hand-to-mouth, but more, downtrodden, right? And they came as refugees. The Dutch, almost to a family, made a conscious decision, right? And it's interesting, they made a conscious decision to leave what was then the most prosperous nation in the world, right? If you've read book called The Embarrassment of Riches about the Netherlands in the 1600s, you really scratch their head, why would anyone leave there? It was like, you know, America in its prime, like, but some Dutch people decided that they would go. But I do think, yes, I do think that there was a socioeconomic difference. And then that difference, again, when the Yankees came and invaded Albany in the 1790s, then the Yankees were the wealthy families, right? Yeah, the Cornings, the Townsends, like by the time Altamont became a established summer resort in the 1870s and 1880s, it was almost exclusively English families that had made their money in Albany post 1800. The Dutch families by that time, the Schuylers, the Lansings, the Prines, they were kind of, they were living off old money, and they couldn't quite keep pace with the industrial money that was being made by the Yankees.
Jeff, when was the dam built at French's Hollow, and what sites did we lose to the flooding?
I want to say 1918, I think. Someone might want to challenge me on that, but it definitely right around World War I. And we did lose some very significant sites. We lost the Vroman farm. We lost the Wemple farm. Abraham Wemple was the head of the 2nd Albany County militia based in Schenectady. Now, it's interesting. That area of our area to the west of here was settled almost exclusively by people from Schenectady coming south, right? The Wemples, the Vromans, the Skimmerhorns, and that Normanskill Valley was so fertile. They said the corn would grow higher than, you know, a horse's head. The land was so fertile. They were very, very prosperous farmers. Abraham Wemple was the head of the 2nd Albany militia. He also was a very important person after the war dealing with the Oneidas. The Oneidas were the only tribe of and the Tuscaroras to align with the Americans. All the other ones aligned with the British, and that's one of the reasons why the Iroquois are really no longer in New York. They chose the wrong side in the war. The Oneidas did. They sided with the Americans. But after the Sullivan-Clinton campaign, when the American forces routed all the other Iroquois tribes' lands out in the Finger Lakes and western New York, in retaliation, the next year the British came and burned the Oneida villages in what's now Oneida County. So the Oneidas had to take refuge, and they did so in the Pine Bush, south of Schenectady. They set up special camps for the Oneidas, and Colonel Wemple was very instrumental in that project. And apparently the Oneidas had so much gratitude to Wemple that they asked that he be one of the designated commissioners after the war to settle the claims between New York State and the Oneidas. And they actually the Oneida Nation gave Colonel Wemple a major piece of land out in Oneida County in gratitude for, you know, being a friend to the tribe. But his farm is now under the waters of the Watervliet Reservoir, and the Vroman farm, and I got the first name wrong, Walter Vroman, I think it was. He was part of a expedition in the late years of the war that went after Brant and Butler after one of their raids, and was surprised and captured and taken to Canada, and was a prisoner for 2 or 3 years in Montreal. Released, came back to his farm, which is now underwater. But they think his daughter married a Winnie, and if anyone knows where Gardner and Kim Gurney lived down underneath the power lines, it used to be the McNiven's house when I was growing up. That was the Winnie farm, and they think Walter Vroman, they think he's buried there on that farm. So, and one other, and I always bring this up, particularly when the supervisor's in the room. There's a great story involving a German family, and what was really interesting too, I didn't touch on it here, but German migration to the United States, most people think like 1750s, 1760s, right? You think Pennsylvania, Bucks County, Lancaster, that area, what's known as Pennsylvania Dutch. They're not Dutch, they're German, right? But the mass migration that came, thousands came to America before the war. Most of them settled in Pennsylvania, right? But the first German immigration to America was here, right? So, and this was a substantial enough German community that when some of those who came in the 1750s, they found their way up here, right? So a number of families, and I wrote them down, like the Kraunces, they came in the 1750s, right? Because this was welcoming, right? There was a Lutheran church. They could worship in their faith. They could speak the language, right? So it attracted, beyond the initial German Palatine settlers, it then attracted additional German settlers right up to the war. And then the other thing that's really interesting, at least to me, is the top of the hill. We know that the top of the hill was more Tory than down here, right? Tory Cave. And the Bern militia, the Beaver Dam militia, which was largely sort of west of Knox and west, that militia, I think it had 85 members on the eve of the Revolution, 62 of whom became loyalists. 62 out of 85 decided to stick with the crown, right? So the area that, in what I talked about, Feckberg, at the top of the hill, where that Zion Lutheran Church is, that was almost exclusively, if not predominantly, German, right? They were also very loyalist, and like where Phil lives, almost exclusively German, almost exclusively loyalist, right? I came across a number of names. Just read. These are the German names that came in around Altamont and stayed: Barclay, Augsbury, Livingston, Hochstrasser, Featherly, Kraunz, Frederick, Kienholz, Furbeck, Sidderly, Kleichmann, right? Anyone who's an Old Town Altamont person will recognize those names, right? Between the churches and those are good Altamont names that have carried forward into this century. Now here's some other names: Reichmeyer, Frinks, Augsburger, Glebman, Kosbuth, Fancher, Betschker, Barnscheld, Heberle, Ecker, Scheffer, Bedstead, Castleman, Furman, Ackley, Engel, Kress, Ebert. Those were all Germans who were kicked out after the war, right? And they lived at the top of the hill, right? The patroon, who was very patriotic, very much on the American side, he was their lord. He was in charge. He no doubt said, "You're out of here." And off they went to Canada, right? What did they leave? They left really nice, cleared farms, right? Who did that attract? A bunch of Yankees from Connecticut, right? So the Whipples, the Denisons, the Hungerfords, the Craries, right? Another group of the Williams, the Dyers, all good Hellebergh, Altamont names. They came from Connecticut circa 1790 and took the farms of all those Germans that were sent to Canada. Really interesting stuff. Like how the land and who owned the land and how they got the land, how it's connected with the politics and the ethnicity. I just find really fascinating. But I'm long-winded here. The point I was getting was the Featherly family. They're my favorite local patriot family because the father and his youngest son were patriots. They fought for They fought at the Battle of Normanskill. They fought at Saratoga. At the Battle of Normanskill, they fought against two other people named Featherly, his two other sons, right? So right here, their farm is right across from Stossett's nursery. It used to be that Christmas tree farm there. And the father and the son, the patriots, they're buried somewhere in there. The marker's missing. But I find that story fascinating. In one family, the father and the youngest son fought against the two brothers, and the oldest brother was the local blacksmith in the settlement that around Osborne Corners. That son went to Canada. He got a grant from the Crown of a very nice farm right on the St. Lawrence River, and 30 years after, his farm was the site of, it was called the Battle of Chrysler's Farm. Yeah. Interestingly, it was misnamed. The Chrysler farm was actually next door. Chrysler was a guy from Schoharie who was a notorious Tory who got kicked out, but it was actually fought on Featherly's land. And the Battle of Chrysler's Farm is what prevented the Americans from getting to Montreal during the War of 1812. But they had their roots here. So, but that land, I bring that up because that land is under considerable development pressure. There was a proposal before the town to put a contractor's storage yard on that property, which I just think would be, a real loss if we lost that, and particularly before we can find where the Patriot is buried. So I would highlight that as one to really keep an eye on. But, all good? How'd I do on time?
Well, we know that Jeff is often very, very bored and doesn't have enough to do, so I hope you will join me in encouraging Jeff to write a new Old Hellebergh, and then someday come back and tell us how the American Revolution ended.
Yes, I
Jeff
promise.
Perlee, everybody,
I
thank you.
promise. Thank you.